Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition, and today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island from by G. Edward Griffin. And this particular book is the fifth edition. Subtitle is called A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. So, before we begin, I just want to do a quick plug and then we'll jump right into the book. If you're new, welcome. If you're returning viewers, welcome. If you enjoy what we're doing, please consider our other book clubs. Mondays, we have our spiritual book clubs where we read spiritual books. And then Wednesdays, we have our health book club where we read health books, anything related to health. And then, of course, Thursdays, we have our financial book club, which this book is under. So we put all the books that we've read as well as the current books on YouTube. So please check out our YouTube channel. We have podcasts that we do on there. I interview interesting people and I try to put out podcasts pretty regularly. So check us out there. And if you do feel inspired, please subscribe and share and all that good stuff so that we can share timeless wisdom with people. You know, it's not about me, it's about the wisdom and the knowledge that we accumulate. And the shoulders, the big teachers, all the teachers that we stand on, the shoulders, or whatever that phrase is called, I don't remember now. The shoulders of giants, or whatever it is. Anyways, we appreciate all of them and their knowledge and their time and energy. So, if you have a book that you want to recommend us to read, whether it's spiritual, health, or financial, I'll put a link in the description box below and you can recommend it and we will consider it. We do like classic books because they've been around for a long time and they do have a lot of wisdom and knowledge. Just, but we'll consider any book that, you recommend. So I appreciate that very much in advance. We have a newsletter that we put out for free once a month. So please go to our website and sign up for that and follow us, whatever it is that we're doing, and follow us there. And if you find this helpful, valuable, if you find it has value to you, please support us. We appreciate that very, very, very much. You can do that by buying me a coffee and checking out our merch section, which is our shop section on our website. We have new designs coming out every month, especially for the Christmas holiday. Not just Christmas, but like the holiday seasons. We have holiday designs for both pets, dogs and cats, and then humans. So check us out there. And if you are in the LA area or visiting LA for business or pleasure, come visit us. Consider come visiting us in person. We have a healing center that we use technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing for both animals, dogs and cats, and humans. So you can learn all about that service on our website, and I'll leave a link in the description box below there as well. And yeah, so visit us in person. We have it on our website. Learn more about the technology on our website and our other services that we provide on our website as well. So, okay. Now, let us begin our reading. This is chapter 23, and this will be part 3. And we are moving quite along. If you have been sticking with us all this time, kudos to you. I really congratulate your tenacity and your determination. This is one of those books, I think, in my opinion, that should be read in every high school. I think high school. And it probably should be studied. It's a good textbook. That's what I'm trying to say. It's got a lot of good information, a lot of good history. So, anyways, let us begin. Again, this is chapter 23, and this will be part 3. Okay, let's do it. Tulips in the stock market. During the final phase of America's credit expansion of the 1920s, the rise in prices on the stock market was entirely speculative. Buyers did not care if their stocks were overpriced compared to the dividends they paid. Commonly traded issues were selling for 20 to 50 times their earnings. Some traded at 100. Speculators acquired stock merely to hold for a while and then sell it at a profit. It was it was, quote, the greater fool strategy. No matter how high the price is today, there will be a higher fool tomorrow who will buy it at an even higher price. For a while, that strategy seemed to work. To make the game even more exciting, it was common for investors to purchase their stocks on margin. That means the buyer puts up a small amount of money as a deposit, the margin, and borrows the rest from his stockbroker, who gets it from the bank, which gets it from the Fed. In the 1920s, the margin for small investors was as low as 10%. Although the average stock yielded a modest 3% annual dividend, speculators were willing to pay over 12% interest on their loans, meaning their stock had to appreciate about 9% per year just to break even. These margin accounts are sometimes referred to as, quote, call loans because the broker has the right to call them in on very short notice, often as short as 24 hours. If the stockbroker calls, if the broker calls the loan, the investor must produce the money immediately. And just a side note, what the stocks call loans, there's a phrase in real estate. Oh, call the loan due. I think it's what it's called, where the bank can do the same thing. They have the right, and it's in the fine prints. I think most people probably don't know, where the bank can call the loan due, the whole amount due at any time. It's the same concept. So just a side note there. Okay, onward. If he cannot, okay, so let's read that. Let's start over with that paragraph since I got a little squirrel there. These margin accounts are sometimes referred to as call loans because the broker has the right to call them in on very short notice, often as short as 24 hours. If the broker calls the loan, the investor must produce the money immediately. If he cannot, the broker can obtain the money by selling the stock. In theory, the sale of the stock will be sufficient to cover the loan, but in practice, about the only time brokers call their loans is when the market is tumbling. Under those circumstances or under those conditions, the stock cannot be sold except at a loss, a total loss of the investor's margin, and a variable loss to the broker depending on the severity of the price fall. To obtain even more leverage, investors sometimes use the stocks they already own as collateral for a margin loan on new stocks. Therefore, if they cannot cover a margin call on their new stocks, they will lose their old stocks as well. In any event, such silly concerns are not in vogue in the 1920s. From August of 1921 to September of 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Stock Price average went from 663.9 to 381.17, a rise of 597%. Credit was abundant, loans were cheap, profits were big. Banks become speculators. The commercial banks were the middlemen in this giddy game. By the end of the decade, they were functioning more like speculators than banks. Instead of serving as dependable clearing issues or clearing loan or clearing houses for money, sorry, they also have become players in the market. Loans to commercial enterprises for the production of goods and services, which normally are the backbone of sound banking practice, were losing ground to loans for speculating in the stock market and in urban real estate. Between 1921 and 1929, while commercial loans remained constant, Total bank loans increased from $24,121. Sorry, that's not right. $24,121 million. Is that how you say it? That's a very interesting number. I mean, the way he wrote it. Mm. Anyways, to $35,711 million. Maybe it's 35,711. I don't know how to read that. He really writes it kind of weird. It's almost easier if he just wrote it all out in digits. But anyways, you get the idea. It's a lot of money and it's in millions of dollars. Okay, loans on securities and real estate rose nearly $8 billion. Thus, about 70% of the increase during this period was in speculative investments, and that money was created by the banks. New York banks and trust companies had over $7 billion on loan to brokers at the New York Stock Exchange for use in margin accounts. Before the war, there were 250 securities dealers. By 1929, the number had grown to 6,500. The banks not only generated the money for speculation, they became speculators themselves by purchasing large blocks of high yield bonds, many of which were of dubious quality. Those were the kinds of securities that were difficult to liquidate in a declining market. Borrowing money on short term and investing on long term, the banks were maneuvering themselves into a precarious situation. Did the Federal Reserve cause the speculation in the stock market? Of course not. Speculators did that. The Fed undoubtedly had other objects in mind, but that did not cancel its responsibility. It was acutely aware of the psychological effect of easy credit and had consciously used that knowledge to manipulate public behavior on numerous occasions. Behavioral psychology is a necessary tool of the trade, so it could claim neither ignorance nor innocence. In the unfolding of this tragedy, it was about as innocent as a spider whose web accidentally, quote, accidentally caught the fly. The final bubble. In the spring of 1928, the Federal Reserve expressed concern over speculation in the stock market and raised interest rates to curb the expansion of credit. The growth in the money supply began to slow down, and so did the rise in stock prices. It is conceivable that the soaring economy could have been brought in for a soft landing, except that there were other agendas to be considered. Professor Quigley had said that central bankers were not substantive powers unto themselves, but were as marionettes whose strings were pulled by others. Just as the speculation spree appeared to be coming under control, those strings were yanked and this Federal Reserve flip-flopped once again. The strings originated in London. Even after 7 years of subsidy by the Federal Reserve, the British economy was sagging from the weight of its socialist system, and gold was moving back into the United States. The Fed, in spite of its own public condemnation of excessive speculation, reversed itself at the brink of success and purchased over $300 million of bankers' acceptances in the last half of 1928, which caused an increase in the money supply of almost $2 billion. Professor Rothbard says, Europe, as we have noted, that's a quote, Europe, as we have noted, had found the benefits from the 1927 inflation dissipated. And European opinion now clamored against any tighter money in the US. The easing in late 1928 prevented gold inflows into the US from getting very large. Great Britain was again losing gold, and sterling was weak once more. The United States the United States bowed once again to its overriding wish to see Europe avoid the inevitable consequences of its own inflationary policies. And that quote was from Rothbard, Depression, page 147. Prior to the Fed's reversal of policy, stock prices had actually declined by 5%. Now they went through the roof, rising 20% from July to December. The boom had returned in spades. Then, in February of 1929, a curious event happened. Montague Norman traveled to the United States once again to confer privately with the officers of the Federal Reserve. He also met with Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury. There is no detailed public record of what transpired at these closed meetings, but we can be certain of three things. It was important. It concerned the economies of America and Great Britain, and it was thought best not to tell the public what was going on. It is not unreasonable to surmise that the central bankers had come to the conclusion that the bubble, not only in America but in Europe, was probably going to rupture very soon. Rather than fight it as they had in the past, it was time to stand back and let it happen, clear out the speculators, and return the markets to reality. As Galbraith put it, quote, how much better, as seen from the Federal Reserve, to let nature take its course and thus allow nature to take the blame, end quote. And that quote was from Galbraith, page 181. Mellon was even more emphatic. Herbert Hoover described Mellon's views as follows. This is a quote. Mr. Mellon had only one formula: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers, liquidate real estate. He insisted that when the people get an inflation brainstorm, the only way to get it out of their blood is to let it collapse. He held that even a panic was not altogether a bad thing. He said, quote, it will purge the rottenness out of the system. High cost of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people. End quote. And that quote was from, quoted by Burton Hirsch, The Mellon Family, A Fortune in History, New York, William Morrow and Company, 1948, page 290. If this had been the mindset between Mellon and Norman and the Federal Reserve Board, the purpose of their meetings would have been to make sure that when the implosion happened, the central banks could coordinate their policies. Rather than be overwhelmed by it, they should direct it as best they can and turn it ultimately to their advantage. Perhaps we shall never know if that scenario is accurate, but the events that followed strongly support such a view. Advance warning for members only. Immediately after the meetings, the monetary scientists began to issue warnings to their colleagues in the financial fraternity to get out of the market. On February 6th, the Federal Reserve issued an advisory to its members' banks to liquidate their holdings in the stock market. The following month, Paul Warburg gave the same advice in the annual report to the stockholders of his International Acceptance Bank. He explained the reason for that advice. Quote, if the orgies of unrestrained speculation are permitted to spread, the ultimate collapse is certain not only to affect the speculators themselves, but to bring about a general depression involving the entire country. End quote. And this quote was from a footnote on that. This advice was reprinted in the Commercial and Financial Chronicle, March 9th, 1929, page 1444. Paul Warburg was a partner with Kuhn Loeb and Company, which maintained a list of preferred customers. Excuse me. I'm burping my coffee. Okay. These were fellow bankers, wealthy industrialists, prominent politicians, and high officials in foreign governments. Okay, I feel like I need to sneeze. Give me 1 minute. Or maybe not. Okay, I got a little tickly nose. It went away. All right. Where was I? A similar list was maintained at JP Morgan Company, It was customary to give these men advance notice on important stock issues. Side note, also known as insider trading, and an opportunity to purchase them at 2 to 15 points below their price to the public. That was one of the means by which investment bankers maintained influence over the affairs of the world. The men on these lists were notified of the coming crash. John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Joseph P. Kennedy, Bernard Baruch, Henry Morgenthau, Douglas Dillon. The biographies of all the Wall Street giants at that time boast that these men were, quote, wise enough to get out of the stock market just before the crash. And it is true. Virtually all of the inner club was rescued. There is no record of any member of the interlocking directorate between the Federal Reserve, the major New York banks, and their prime customers having been caught by surprise. Wisdom apparently was greatly affected by those lists one was on. A message of comfort to the public. While the crew was abandoning ship, the passengers were told it was a lovely cruise. President Coolidge and Treasury Secretary Mellon had been vociferous in their public utterances that the economy was in better shape than ever. From his socialist perch in London, John Maynard Keynes exclaimed that the management of the dollar by the Federal Reserve Board was a triumph of man over money. And from the plush offices of his New York Federal Reserve Bank, Benjamin Strong boasted, quote, the very existence of the Federal Reserve System is a safeguard against anything like a calamity growing out of money rates. In former days, the psychology was different because the facts of the banking situation was different. Mob panic and consequently mob disaster is less likely to arise. End quote. And that quote was quoted by Grider, page 298. The public was comforted, and the balloon continued to expand. It is now time to sharpen the pen. On April 19th, the Fed held an emergency meeting under cloak of great secrecy. The following day, the New York Times reported as follows. Reserve Council confers in haste. Atmospheres of mystery is thrown about its meeting in Washington. An atmosphere of deep mystery was thrown about the proceedings both by the board and the council. No advance announcement had been made that an extraordinary session of the council was contemplated, and the fact that the members were in the city became known only when newspaper correspondents happened to see some of them entering the Treasury Department building. Even after that, excessive replies were given. While the joint meeting was in progress at the Treasury Department, every effort was made to guard the proceedings, and a group of newspaper correspondents were asked to leave the corridor. And that there's a end note about that. You can find that in the Reserve Council confers in haste, New York Times, April 20th, 1929, page 89. Let us return briefly to Montague Norman. His biographer tells us, excuse me, let me have a drink of water here. Okay, let's try that paragraph again. Let us return briefly to Montague Norman. His biographer tells us that after he became head of the Bank of England, his custom was to journey to the United States several times each year. Although his arrival was seldom noted by the press, he traveled in disguise wearing a long black cloak and a large, broad-brimmed hat, and he used the pseudonym of Professor Skinner. And the footnote on that was Hargrave, page 1. It was on one of those unpublicized trips that he ran into a young Australian by the name of W.C. Wentworth. 60 years later, Wentworth wrote a letter to the Australians, a newspaper in Sydney, and told of his encounter. This is a quote. In 1929, I was a member of the Oxford and Cambridge athletic team, visiting America to run against American universities. Late in July, we split up to return, and I, together with some other members, boarded a smallish passenger vessel in New York. There were, of course, no airplanes in those days. A fellow passenger was Mr. Skinner, and a member of our team recognized him. He was Montague Norman, returning to London after a secret visit to the U.S. Central Bank, traveling incognito. When we told him we knew who he was, he asked us not to blow his cover, because if the details of his movement were made public, it could have serious financial consequences. Naturally, we agreed, and on the days following, as we crossed the Atlantic, he talked to us very frankly. He said, in the next few months, there is going to be a shakeout, but don't worry, it won't last for long. And that quote was from Letters to the Editor, The Australian, GPO Box 4162, Sydney, NSW. That stands for New South Wales, 2001, February 7, 1989. On August 9th, just a few weeks after that shipboard encounter, the Federal Reserve Board reversed its easy credit policy and raised the discount rate to 6%. A few days later, the Bank of England raised its rate also. Bank reserves in both countries began to shrink, and along with them, as so did the money supply. Simultaneously, the system began to sell securities in the open market, a maneuver that also contracts the money supply. Call rates on margin loans had jumped to 15, then 20%. The pin had been inserted. The duck dinner begins. The securities market reached its high point on September 19th. Then it began to slide. The public was not yet aware that the end had arrived. The roller coaster had dipped before. Surely it would shoot upward again. For 5 more weeks, the public bought heavily on the way down. More than 1 million shares were traded during that period. Then, on Thursday, October 24th, like a giant school of fish suddenly turning direction in response to an unseen signal, thousands of investors stampeded to sell. The ticker tape was hopelessly overloaded. Prices tumbled. 13 million shares exchanged hands. Everyone said the bottom had dropped out of the market. They were wrong. 5 days later, it did. It did. On Tuesday, October 29, the exchanges were crushed by an avalanche of selling. At times, there were no buyers at all. By the end of the trading session, over 16 million shares had been dumped, in most cases at any price that was offered. Within a single day, millions of investors were wiped out. Within a few weeks of further decline, $3 billion of wealth had disappeared. Within 12 months, $40 billion had vanished. People who had counted their paper profits and thought they were rich suddenly found themselves to be very poor. The other side of the coin is that for every seller, there was a buyer. The insiders who had moved their investments into cash and gold were the buyers. It must be remembered that falling stock prices didn't necessarily mean that there was anything wrong with the stocks. Those representing solid companies were still paying dividends and were good investments at a realistic price. In the panic, prices had tumbled far below their natural levels. Those who had the cash picked them up for a small fraction of their true worth. Giant holding companies were formed for that task, such as Marine Midland Corporation, the Lehman Corporation, and the Equity Corporation. JP Morgan set up the food trust called Standard Brands. Like the shark swallowing the mackerel, the big speculators devoured the small. Big fish eat little fish, right? That's what my teacher says. And he's talking about the energy world. Here we're talking about the financial world. Interesting, eh? There is no evidence that the crash was planned for the purpose of profit taking. There was considerable motivation for the monetary scientists to avert it, and they might have done so had not their higher priority agendas gotten in the way. Yet, once they realized the inevitability of a collapse in the market, they were not bashful about using their privileged position to take full advantage of it. In that sense, FDR's son-in-law, Curtis Dahl, was right when he wrote, quote, "It was the calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers," end quote. And that quote was from Curtis B. Dahl, FDR, my exploited father-in-law. Tulsa, Oklahoma Christian Crusade Publications, 1967, page 49. Natural law number 5. Natural law number 5. Here is another of those, quote, natural laws of economics that needs to be added to our list. Lesson. It is human nature for man to place personal priorities ahead of all others. Even the best of men cannot long resist the temptation to benefit at the expense of their neighbors if the occasion is placed squarely before them. This is especially true when the means by which they benefit is obscure and not likely to be perceived as such. There may be exceptional men from time to time who can resist that temptation, but their numbers are small. The general rule will prevail in the long run. A managed economy presents men with precisely that kind of opportunity. The power to create and extinguish the nation's money supply provides unlimited potential for personal gain. Throughout history, the granting of that power has been justified as being necessary to protect the public, but the results have always been the opposite. It has been used against the public and for the personal gain of those who control. Therefore, law, when men are entrusted with the power to control the money supply, they will eventually use that power to confiscate the wealth of their neighbors. There is no better illustration of that law than the crash of 1929 and the lingering depression that followed. From crash to depression. The lingering depression is an important part of the history. The speculators had been ruined, but what they lost was money acquired without effort. There were some unfortunate souls who also lost their life savings, but only because they gambled those savings on call loans. Those who bought stock with money they already possessed did not have to sell, and they did quite well in the long run. For the most part, something for nothing had merely been converted back to nothing. The price of stocks had plummeted, but the companies behind them were still producing products, still employing people, and still paying dividends. No one lost his job because the market fell. The tulips were gone, but the wheat crop remained. And just a side note, there's a saying that says there is no free lunch. So, according to, socialist theories, well, let's just say this. People who promise us free stuff, it's not really free. Somebody has to pay for it sooner or later. In whatever shape or form, it doesn't have to be money. It could be energy. It could be resources. Uh, that's just the law. It's called the law of cause and effect. In other words, law of karma. What comes around goes around. So just kind of remember that. So when I hear people say, "Oh, it's free, it's free," I mean, it sounds nice. For example, like the universal basic income. It sounds nice, like free bus rides, free lunch, free this, free that. But it's not free. Just keep that in mind. So, what was the problem? In truth, there was none, at least not yet. The crash, as devastating as it was to the speculators, had little effect on the average American. Unemployment didn't become rampant until the Depression years, which came later and were caused by continued government restraint of the free market. The drop of prices in the stock market was really a long overdue and healthy adjustment to the economy. The stage was now set for recovery and sound economic growth, as always had happened in the past. It did not happen this time. The monetary and political scientists who had created the problem now were in full charge of the rescue. They saw the crash as a golden opportunity to justify even more controls than before. Herbert Hoover launched a multitude of government programs to bolster wage rates, prevent prices from dropping, prop up failing firms, stimulate construction, guarantee home loans, protect the depositors, rescue the banks, subsidize the farmers, and provide public works. In other words, just a side note, FDR started all that welfare thing, right? And I don't know if it was meant to be short term or not, but it ended up being long term and people became dependent on it. So, cause and effect, the law of karma. FDR was swept into office by promising even more of the same under the slogan, the New Deal. And the Federal Reserve launched a series of, quote, banking reforms, all of which were measures to further extend its power over the money supply. In 1931, fresh money was pumped into the economy to restart the cycle, but this time the rocket would not lift off. The dead weight of new bureaucracies and government regulations and subsidies and taxes and welfare benefits and deficit spending and tinkering with prices had kept it on the launching pad. Eventually, the productive foundation of the country also began to crumble under the weight. Taxes and regulatory agencies forced companies out of business. Those that remained had to curtail production. Unemployment began to spread. By every economic measure, the economy was no better or worse in 1939 than it was in 1930 when the rescue began. It wasn't until the outbreak of World War II and the tooling up for war production that followed that the Depression was finally brought to an end. It was a dubious save. In almost every way, it was a repeat of the drama played out with World War I, even to the names of two of its most important players. FDR and Churchill worked together behind the scenes to bring America into the conflict. Churchill wanting American assistance in a war England was losing and could not afford. FDR wanted a jolt to the economy for political reasons, and the financiers gathered behind J.P. Morgan wanting the profits of war. But that is another chapter, and this book is long enough. What happened after World War II was the focus of the first 6 chapters. That brings us to the end of the historical record. It's time now to reset the coordinates on our time machine and return to the present. Summary. Congress had been assured that the Federal Reserve Act would decentralize banking power away from Wall Street. However, within a few years of its inception, the system was controlled by the New York Federal Reserve Bank under the leadership of Benjamin Strong, whose name was synonymous with the Wall Street Money Trust. During the 9 years before the crash of 1929, the Federal Reserve was responsible for a massive expansion of the money supply. A primary motive for that policy was to assist the government of Great Britain to pay for its socialist programs, which by then had drained its treasury. By devaluing the dollar and depressing interest rates in America, investors would move their money to England, where rates and values were higher. That strategy succeeded in helping Great Britain for a while, but it set in motion the forces that made the stock market crash inevitable. The money supply expanded throughout this period, but the trend was interspersed with short spasms of contraction, which were the result of attempts to halt the expansions. Each resolve to use restraints was broken by the higher political agenda of helping the governments of Europe. In the long view, the result of plentiful money and easy credit was a wave of speculation in the stock market and urban real estate that intensified with each passing month. There is circumstantial evidence that the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve had concluded at a secret meeting in February of 1929 that a collapse in the market was inevitable and that the best action was to let nature take its course. Immediately after that meeting, the financiers sent advisory warnings to lists of preferred customers, wealthy industrialists, prominent politicians, and high officials in foreign governments to get out of the stock market. Meanwhile, the American people were being assured that the economy was in sound condition. On August 19th, the Federal Reserve applied the pin to the bubble. It increased the bank loan rate and began to sell securities in the open market. Both actions have the effect of reducing the money supply. Rates on brokers' loans jumped to 100, rates on brokers' loans jumped 20%, jumped to 20%. On August 29th, the stock market collapsed. Thousands of investors were wiped out in a single day. The investors who were forewarned and had converted their stocks into cash while prices were still high. They now became the buyers. Some of the greatest fortunes in America were made in this fashion. End of chapter 23. Wow. Quite a history, isn't it? I think it's important to know your history because humans are very slow to learn. I think part of it's because we don't know our history. But, anyways, I hope you enjoyed that, and we will continue next time with a new chapter. And in the meantime, be sure to check out our newsletters and our YouTube channel and all that good stuff I talked about in the beginning. Okay, I hope you guys all have a great day and a great week, and I hope to see you soon. Bye bye now.